So, I've dubbed it imperial withdrawal syndrome, and every single time I do a video on about this, you get a mixture of reaction. You get people who are just like, yeah, I 100% agree with you. Then you get the people who are just like, what? No, Brexit had nothing to do with these imperial fantasies. You then get the Brexiteers who are just exactly the same and just go, oh, it had nothing to do with these imperial adventures. It's all to do with, sovereignty. Even though, especially the activities of the past week have proved that they don't give a damn about parliamentary sovereignty. And this comes from The Guardian. And it's exactly what we've been talking about when we're talking about post-imperial withdrawal syndrome. So it's Britain must rid itself of the delusion that it is big, bold and in charge. So, with a disorderly Brexit on the horizon, a timely lesson in humility may be fast approaching. True. So, being powerful, Margaret Thatcher once said, is like being a lady. If you have to tell people you are, you aren't. It's a lesson that could be useful and be learned by Gavin Williamson, the efficient defence secretary who longs to inherit her job. And we've already talked about Gavin Williamson and his fantasy of wanting to have, naval bases around the world. Why? It's pointless. Like a one-man military band, Williamson spent the Christmas period blowing the trumpet, twirling the baton and banging the drum for Brexit Britain. Leaving the EU, he told the Daily Telegraph, would restore Britain as a truly global player, determined to once again play the role on the world stage that the world expects us to play. What? No one is expecting that. Post-Brexit, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, the Caribbean countries and nations across Africa would look to us to provide the moral leadership, the military leadership and the global leadership of which they have been so long deprived. This is just post-imperial withdrawal syndrome at its peak, and people don't believe me that this exists. This is why I've coined this term. This is post-imperial withdrawal syndrome at its peak. None of these countries care about this. They don't want this at all. What? Anyway, it continues. The fantasy of a world that longs for British leadership is a bold claim from a government that can barely tie its own shoelaces. Yet, like so many delusions, it has deep historical roots. It has been a blight on British diplomacy since 1945, souring its relations not only with the EU but with the Commonwealth countries to whom Williamson makes his pitch. At the end of the Second World War, Britain's commitment to global leadership remained undimmed, despite its severe reduction in power. So governments of both parties turned to the Commonwealth and its organisation as an organisation that has only to develop its resources to match the power of the United States. Sound familiar? Yet hopes that the Commonwealth would serve as a proxy empire, retaining the benefits of the imperial connection without its unfashionable colonial regalia, are swiftly disappointed. What had been a gathering of white Anglo-Saxon statements became less white, less British, and less deferent to instructions from Whitehall. The result was a backlash against the organisation that had anticipated later criticism of the EU. In the 1970s and 80s, the Commonwealth featured in public debate chiefly as a problem. It was a body that did things to Britain rather than for it, which allowed ungrateful foreigners to fleece Britain of cash, interfere in its affairs, and take advantage of its immigration laws. Britain complained in a Scottish newspaper had become the old convenient milking cow, wielding an ever-open wallet on one which the sun never sets. Enoch Powell dismissed the organisation as a humbug, and more recently Boris Johnson joked that its main purpose was to provide the Queen with cheering crowds of flag-waving pickaninnies. As the hopes vested in the Commonwealth begin to fade, governments did not adjust their ambitions. Instead, they transferred them to the European Economic Community. It was economic weakness that pushed governments towards membership, but like a shipwrecked child in a Victorian adventure story who crawl to shore, promptly declare themselves king and queen, policymakers rarely doubted that Britain's rightful place in Europe was at its head. Gordon Brown, a Labour Foreign Secretary, urged Willy Brandt in 1967 to let us in so we can take the lead. His boss Harold Wilson wrote privately that if we continue to dominate that lot, there won't be much. There wasn't much to be said for us. For Thatcher, likewise, Europe was simply a new vehicle for Britain's historic vocation to power, an impulse that had carried our flags, our trade, our culture, and our justice to the corners of the earth. It was this traditional outward-looking role, she declared, that had brought Britain into the ECC, for where power resides, there must be British influence be exerted. That view was echoed in the press. The Daily Mail celebrated ascension with the headline, "Now we can lead Europe." And while the Sun told its readers that membership offered an unrepeatable opportunity for a nation that lost an empire to gain a continent. Such rhetoric continued into the 90s and beyond. Tony Blair promised in 1997 to give Britain the leadership in Europe which Britain and Europe needed, and to use our leadership position to put Britain at the centre of international decision-making. Gordon Brown called his book on the 2016 referendum Britain Leading, Not Leaving, insisting that Britain had always led the way when things had been difficult in Europe. And I think it's time that we were a leader again. David Cameron likewise proclaimed that the European need for a big, bold, brave Britain at the heart of its institutions. Yet, this is such an impossible standard for membership of a multinational community. Successive governments persistently refused to reimagine themselves as an equal partner, and in the imagination of Brexit, the right, if Britain could not be king, it must be a vassal, a prisoner, or a colony. In consequence, Britain is fast becoming the King Lear of the diplomatic world, rampagingly insanely around the stage, blaming everyone else for the loss of his kingdom. How sharper than a serpent's tooth it is to have a thankless Commonwealth and continent. The liberation of Britain so urgently needs is not from Brussels, but from its own illusions. A lesson in humility is fast approaching, but a disorderly Brexit would be a cruel teacher. As so often, it would not be the worst delinquents who would pay the highest price. This is exactly what we've been talking about for so long on this channel. All these Brexiteer delusions are rooted in a historical context, and that is the one of the British Empire. And it's stated there, you know, by Gavin Williamson himself, the defence, bear in mind, this guy is the Defence Secretary. So, it would restore Britain as a truly global player, determined once again to play the role on the world stage that the world expects us to play. So somehow, everyone in the world is expecting Britain to lead. No one is at all. No one. Again, he's completely dreaming. And post-Brexit, he continues, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Caribbean countries and nations right across Africa would look to us to provide the moral leadership, the military leadership, and the global leadership of which they have been too long deprived. That, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call post-imperial withdrawal syndromes. And the only way to divest yourself of such symptoms is to look at facts and look at the reality of Britain. Britain no longer has an empire. It can no longer rule the waves. It is a nation unto itself. We are an island, and leaving Europe will only make us weaker.